Welcome back. So the next topic we have in our survey of the preschool learning foundations, the social emotional section, is cooperation and responsibility. It's a topic that's closely related to self-regulation, which we've already talked about. And it's a topic of particular concern to child care providers, preschool educators, early childhood classroom teachers, because, of course, of the ways in which children in the early childhood years are learning the skills of being a cooperative group member, of how to get along with others, about how to participate in group activities, about how to get along, all the skills that are developing in important ways in the preschool years. But before we talk about cooperation and responsibility, we've got to talk a little bit about one of the characteristics of preschoolers that current research is giving us a new perspective on, and it directly relates to their ability to cooperate and to be responsible citizens of the classroom community. You know, probably you, like I, were taught as you were learning about child development that one of the characteristics of young children is that they are egocentric. Is that they, in other words, have trouble understanding the feelings and the thoughts and the perspectives of other people, especially when they conflict with the child's own, because children of this age are so consumed by their own experience that they have difficulty understanding how other children or other people could see things differently. This is an idea that came to us from Piaget's theory, and it is a deeply seated part of how we think about young children. But one of the remarkable discoveries of research in the last 10 to 15 years has been the ways in which it has challenged the notion that young children are fundamentally egocentric, and indeed has given us an understanding of early social and emotional understanding that turns the idea of egocentrism right on its head. What the new research is telling us, amazingly enough, is that not only from early childhood, but from infancy, young children have the idea that other people have feelings and desires and points of view that are different from their own. They have this idea from early on, and one of their consuming passions, beginning in the early childhood years, is to try to understand what's going on in other people's heads, because they already have a grasp that that will help them understand why people act as they do. And so virtually from infancy, researchers are discovering that far and away from being egocentric, infants and toddlers and young children are striving very hard to understand the internal mental states that underlie people's behavior. Now, what's the evidence underlying this? What's the reason for this change in perspective about young children's social and emotional understanding? Well, some of it comes from a phenomenon that we're all very familiar with. We see it all the time when we see infants in a supermarket, when we see babies in everyday settings. And it has to do with situations in which a baby doesn't know how to respond to something that's new or unfamiliar. And in fact, what they do is they look to a trusted adult for emotional cues. Take, for example, a situation that we have done in our research in a study a number of years ago. We had a 12-month-old infant in the room, seated on his mother's lap. There were some toys for the child to play with, but after a few moments, something very unexpected happened. A small robot came in from a door on one side of the room, and the robot looked like nothing else the child had ever seen before. It was brightly decorated, it had feathers and other things coming out of the top. This robot moved across the room toward the child, then turned direction, moved away from the child, and then moved back again and finally stopped, emitting beeps every 5 seconds or so. Now, believe me, no baby had seen anything like this. The robot was large enough to be potentially threatening, but it was also very, very interesting. Well, you can imagine how the babies in our study immediately responded when they saw this robot beginning to approach them. They immediately looked to the face of their mothers. And of course, if their mothers were looking at the robot, and as the baby caught their gaze, the mothers looked panic-stricken, you can imagine how the babies responded. And in fact, this is how they responded in our study. If the mothers looked scared or frightened by the robot, they immediately retreated back to her. Had nothing to do with that unfamiliar, attractive, but now threatening robot, and they wanted to be in her lap. On the other hand, if the mothers looked at the robot and looked reassuring, if they looked comfortable with that unfamiliar, strange robot entering the room, then the babies were much more reassured, and having caught that expression on their mothers' faces, they were happy to approach the robot, and they began to play with it. The interesting thing was, if based on our instructions, mothers, instead of looking at the robot, looked out the window and looked reassuring or panic-stricken, babies didn't know what to do. And in fact, what they often did is they went back to their mothers and tried to pull on her hand or in some way redirect her gaze toward this other object about which they were seeking information. Now, this phenomenon that I just described to you is something we see all the time, and it's called social referencing. It describes the way in which 12-month-olds will look to the face of a trusted adult for emotional cues when faced with an uncertain event or situation. It's something that we see in grocery stores, at least I used to, before my wife asked me to stop going grocery shopping with her, because I would take time out to greet any young baby in a stroller or in the shopping cart with their mother. And of course, this is exactly what the babies would do. Faced with this friendly but strange adult, they look to their mothers to get some cues about how to respond. And yet, in this very familiar situation of social referencing, it's easy for us to overlook the sophistication of how a baby is thinking about the information they can get from their mother. Because think about it. For a baby to look to the mother's face for emotional information about an unfamiliar event that they're both looking at, the child has to have an awareness that, first of all, what mother's looking at is provoking some kind of a mental event that is of interest to the baby. And furthermore, the baby has to understand that the emotional expression the mother is showing is an emotional expression that's in response to what she's looking at. So already by 12 months of age, in this very familiar kind of phenomenon we call social referencing, babies are showing a remarkable understanding of what goes on in their mother's minds. They understand that what she's looking at is what she's thinking about, and what she's looking at and therefore thinking about is affecting her emotions. And all in these circumstances, the emotions and the response of the mother is different from that of the baby. That's why they're looking to her for cues. And in this respect, they understand that what is going on in mother's mind and her feelings are different from the baby's own, and that's why they're referencing her for important information. Well, that's just the beginning of the understanding that we have that from very early on, infants and young children are aware that other people's internal, subjective viewpoints are different from their own, and now they become consumed with trying to understand what those viewpoints are. Let me give you another example that might even prove more convincing. It's a study that was done in Berkeley a few years ago, and it involved 18-month-olds this time rather than 12-month-old babies. And it's a very simple study, but an elegantly designed one, in which the 18-month-olds were seated at a table on their mother's laps across from an experimenter who was sitting across from them. And in between the experimenter and the baby were two bowls of food. In one bowl was a whole bunch of goldfish crackers. Now, it doesn't take a developmental scientist to tell you that babies, toddlers love goldfish crackers. In the other bowl was a cut up pieces of broccoli. And of course, broccoli is not a favorite fun food for most toddlers. So as they're getting acquainted, the experimenter and the toddler are sampling the different kinds of food in front of them. And much to the baby's surprise, every time the experimenter takes a bite of goldfish crackers, she responds by saying, "Ew, goldfish crackers! I hate goldfish crackers." And every time she took a bite of broccoli, she would go, "Oh, broccoli, that's great. Broccoli is one of my favorite foods." And so immediately the experimenter is responding in a way that is very different from the natural desires of most toddlers for preferences for goldfish crackers over broccoli. And after sampling the foods and the experimenter responding in this way, the critical test takes place. The experimenter now puts her hand right in between the two bowls and says to the toddler, "Give me some more. Give me some more of what I want." Now, if the toddler were responding egocentrically, what would she give the experimenter? Well, she'd give her goldfish crackers, because that's exactly what the toddler wants herself. But in fact, the 18-month-olds in this study reliably gave the experimenter the broccoli that she had shown a preference for. They understood, in other words, that this experimenter had a different set of food preferences than the child had. And in response to the experimenter's request, she gave that adult the food she wanted, even though it wasn't consistent with the child's own preferences. So it's studies like this, and there have been many of them like this, that have convinced us that the idea that young children are egocentric is probably a mistake. And instead, what we see in the early years is exactly the opposite. That young children have an early emerging awareness that what is going on in your head might be different from what is going on in my head. But that what is going on in your head is deeply connected with how you act. And so they have a desire, a strong passion to try to understand the internal thoughts, the feelings, the goals, the intentions, the motives, the beliefs, the desires, the needs, all those internal states that motivate the behavior of people around them. And this becomes much of the course of social and emotional understanding in the early years of life, such that we are continuously being surprised by how much insight infants and toddlers and young children seem to have into the mental states of other people. Now, the reasonable question to ask, therefore, is why is it that we have often seen young children acting egocentrically? How is it that this idea of young children being egocentric has persisted as long as it has and has been very consistent with our common everyday observations of young children? Well, there are several answers to that question. One thing we've realized is that often young children are seen to act egocentrically in situations where they don't have the knowledge or the background information needed to respond in a non-egocentric way. One of the things that researchers used to do, for example, was to ask young preschoolers, what would be a good snack for mommy? But, most young children are not terribly aware of adult culinary preferences. And so they respond as most of us might in a similar situation where we don't know what another person's food preferences are. They simply identify foods that they would like for a snack, and of course they become identified as egocentric. We also have to realize, of course, that oftentimes young children do act egocentrically, and it's not because they don't have enough social information or knowledge in which to make a more appropriate response, but it's simply because, like people of all ages, there are times when they are genuinely selfish, when they genuinely want to play on the tricycle even though other kids don't. Other kids also want to play. In other words, like everybody else, there are times that young children act selfishly. But it's not because they lack the cognitive ability to understand that others have desires and needs and preferences that may conflict with a child's own. They're simply ignoring them as people do at any age of life. So this new view of young children's developing social and emotional knowledge of other people has really revolutionized a lot of our thinking about early childhood development and made us realize that if from a very early age children are passionate in their desire to understand what is going on in other people's heads, then their everyday social experiences, both at home and in early childhood settings, can be powerful opportunities for them to gain the kind of social and emotional understanding they seek. And so one of the things that we try to do as early childhood educators is to put words into the intentions and the desires and the goals and the feelings of other people that the children encounter in the classroom, such that by putting words to those internal states, young children can have a better understanding and can build their social understanding of what these mental states are that affect other people's behavior. When children get in conflict with other children, a good, helpful thing that a teacher can do is to put words into the behaviors of each person so that they can mutually understand why it is they're in conflict, what are the conflicting goals or intentions or desires that are accounting for their being in conflict with each other, and on that understanding, how can they better work out their disagreement? To see early childhood as a period of expanding social and emotional understanding, rather than as a period of egocentrism, can take us a long way toward providing children with the catalysts they need to develop cooperation and responsibility. So that really brings us to our topic of this current segment, which is to help us understand a little bit why it is and how it is that children develop the skills to cooperate with each other in the classroom, to become responsible members of the group, to get along with other children, and also with teachers. Well, not surprisingly, cooperation and responsibility is one of the core social-emotional foundations. You can read about it in the Preschool Learning Foundations book, and you'll find, in fact, the description of cooperation and responsibility on page 15, where we describe how at around 48 months of age, children seek to cooperate with adult instructions, but their capacities for self-control are limited, especially when they are frustrated or upset. And in a way that's consistent with some of the things that we talked about earlier with respect to the development of self-regulation, what we find at the younger ages is that young children do have difficulties even in their efforts to cooperate and get along with others, because their own strong desires, their own strong efforts to accomplish their own goals can get in the way, as well as their emotions. We find at 60 months of age, children have made progress. The strand describes the way in which at this age, children have growing capacities for self-control and are motivated to cooperate in order to receive adult approval, as well as to think approvingly of themselves. Sometimes the challenges to cooperation and responsibility arise not from egocentrism, but it really arises from the lack of cognitive flexibility that we had talked about earlier with respect to self-regulation. That limited flexibility to be able to be wrapped up in your own experience of something, of your joy of playing with a tricycle or painting with paints or building with blocks, and having difficulty, having limited flexibility to appreciate that. Those blocks may well need to be shared with another child who wants to build next to you. You might need to take turns on the tricycle with another child who wants to play with it. And it's that cognitive flexibility, rather than egocentrism, that can be the greater challenge here. Well, when we consider all this together, it really becomes apparent that early childhood is an important period for learning to become a responsible member of the group. And some of the reasons this is true we've already talked about, so let's review them again. This growing ability to cooperate is based on several things. It's based, first of all, on developing self-regulatory competence. So even though children have a really long way to go in their abilities to control their own behaviors and their feelings and their thinking and their attention and their impulses, that anterior cingulate, you may remember, has a maturational course that takes the child all the way through early adulthood. Nevertheless, there are important developmental changes that take place in early childhood, and some of that growth in self-regulation, as it is brain-based in the growth and maturation of the brain, gives the child tools to be able to cooperate more effectively with teachers and with other children in the classroom. In addition, another important psychological resource for the growth of cooperation and responsibility is a child's growing self-awareness. One of the things that researchers have discovered that has kind of knocked our socks off is that in early childhood, it appears that young children are developing a sense of themselves as psychological beings, in addition to the sense of themselves in terms of their physical and behavioral characteristics, which we've always known to be true. We're discovering, in other words, that in addition to being able to talk about, how fast they can run and the kinds of things that they really enjoy doing, and how tall they are and the color of their hair, and that the fact that they're a big boy or a big girl, that young children also possess a growing psychological sense of their characteristics, almost what we might call intuitive personality. We found that at as early as 4 or 5 years of age, young children describe themselves in ways that suggest that they think about themselves in terms of how sociable they are or how timid they are, in terms of how much they're risk takers versus how cautious they are. And of course, they have a developing sense of self-concept or self-image that for most children is fortunately very positive, and unfortunately for some children is already developing in a negative direction. But one of the things that we're becoming aware of is that children are also seeing themselves in a moral sense. They don't think about themselves that way, but rather they do think about themselves in terms of characteristics associated with being a good boy or a good girl. Children will describe themselves and their tendencies to want to try to do the good thing, to try to make amends or try to make it up when they do bad things. They talk about feeling badly when they do the wrong thing. They talk about how valuable or how important it is that other people see them as being a good boy or a good girl. And it's that self-awareness of themselves as a good person that provides a powerful incentive for the development of cooperation and responsibility in the early childhood years. Something we mentioned earlier with respect to developing self-regulation is that in early childhood, we can see evidence for the development of working memory and for growing memory capability as it relates to children's understanding of expectations and routines. If we simply recognize that one of the reasons that young children sometimes fall short in terms of their being able to cooperate and do what is expected when classroom transitions take place or when the greeting activity takes place at circle time in the morning, when we recognize that that's often true because young children simply don't remember those routines and cannot spontaneously recall them as easily as they will just a year or two later, we see the importance of memory for helping children in their efforts to become classroom citizens. As I mentioned earlier, one of the major assets for the development of cooperation and responsibility is improved social and emotional understanding. So again, in contrast to the notion of young children having difficulty understanding others' feelings and desires because they're egocentric, we're now understanding that children, in fact, have a capability of understanding those feelings and desires. Their limited cognitive flexibility may make it hard for them to comprehend those different feelings when they're in conflict with the child's own. But in fact, adults who help children become aware of what other people are seeking, or desiring, or needing, or wanting, or feeling, who can put words to those internal states, can help foster that developing social and emotional understanding and help enlist it into the development of cooperative conduct at this age. And then finally, or almost finally, we should not forget a significant psychological resource in the development of cooperation and responsibility, namely young children's emotional attachments to parents and teachers. That's why one of the characteristics described in the foundations for this strand is the ways in which children are motivated to cooperate in order to seek approval from other people as well as to see themselves in an approving manner. Because in fact, for many, many young children, for most young children, the motivation to do the right thing has a lot to do with seeking esteem, seeking approval in the eyes of important people. That occurs at home, of course, when children will display their accomplishments or seek to have their cooperation noticed by their parents in order to get the applause that they anticipate. But it also happens in the classroom, when children will often beam when a teacher or an adult volunteer draws attention to a child's effort to be helpful to another child. So in contrast to a lot of how we might have been taught early on, I know I was, that the important ways in which young children are motivated to get along with others is through consistent rewards and punishments, where children are encouraged to see it in their self-interest to get along and cooperate with others. One of the things we see here is that a lot of the motivation for children to cooperate, to work together with other people, is in order to see themselves as a good and cooperative child and to be seen by adults who matter in that way as well. Indeed, in many respects, the development of strong, warm, secure attachments between children and their parents and between children and their teachers is like money in the bank as far as children's motivation to do the right thing. And finally, we also know that cultural values and expectations for young children have a lot to do with the development of cooperation and responsibility. We know that children bring with them into the classroom a cultural heritage, sometimes one which emphasizes a sense of responsibility to the group, a sense of the importance of being part of the group and cooperating and contributing to group goals, whereas other children come with a cultural background that more emphasizes individual achievement, standing out, having your own accomplishments recognized, less part of the group and more achieving as an individual. That can have a lot to do with the ease with which children seek to become part of the group, to find their role, to enact that role, to do the right thing, to participate in group activities as a cooperative member. And those cultural differences we need to recognize are part of the psychological resources that children bring with them into the classroom. I hope it's apparent to you that when you look at all these different abilities that children draw on in the preschool years in their efforts to become part of the group and to learn how to get along with others, it really is apparent that not only is a lot more going on here than we had traditionally thought, but that the roots of children's cooperative conduct are far more diverse than simply their responding to consistent rewards or punishments. You know, in the old days when we thought that children were egocentric, moral development theorists like Kohlberg urged us to urge us to understand that early childhood morality is primarily a matter of children seeing it in their self-interest to get along with others. We now understand that children's motivation to get along with others is far more than just seeing it as a matter of, I get some good things out of getting along with you, but rather that children are often motivated because they understand what others want, what others desire, especially if they're helped by teachers in doing so. And they're strongly motivated by their efforts to be seen in a positive way by the adults who matter to them. These really are the foundations for what we might call conscience development, which is an early form of moral development in the early childhood years. Now, there is some remarkable research that is going on in our lab right now that has really helped to nail down this sense of how early and how significant are the foundations for cooperation and responsibility. And really, our research in the lab is built on some studies that we read about not long ago that took place in a laboratory of a colleague of mine in Leipzig, Germany, where he set up a series of procedures for 18-month-olds involving an adult needing assistance. These were very, very simple helping tasks that any toddler could understand. For instance, they involved an adult who was drawing with a marker, and as he was drawing, the marker accidentally fell off onto the floor. Would the child get down and pick up the marker and return it to the adult? Or in another instance, an adult was hanging some clothes on a clothesline, and one of the clothespins dropped down to the floor. And the question was, would a child move away from mother, pick up the clothespin, and return it to the adult? And what that research seemed to be showing is that when young children were faced with clear-cut signs of the adult's need in situations where the child's capacity to offer assistance was also apparent, to a surprising extent, 18-month-old toddlers would in fact help an adult who needed that kind of assistance. Well, we have replicated that study in our laboratory. And we have found the same thing to be true in children in the United States. Let me show you some of those videos.
Here's one blanket. Okay. Here's the other one. Oh. 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 Now I can put my blanket in. What's that? I don't know. I just drew a swirly picture. Oh. Oh, okay. Now I can do more. I can finish my picture.
Flower.
A flower, yeah, it does look like a flower. Oh, 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 okay, I can put it back in.
Yeah.
I'll put this one here, and
Target. Okay. Thank you.
okay, now I have this. I have this, okay.
Now, as remarkable as those observations were of finding that far and away from being egocentric, toddlers would move away from their mothers in order to help an unfamiliar adult in an unfamiliar lab with some simple tasks, that's only half the story of this research. The other half of the story is that in the lab in Germany, there were other conditions in which the same children were observed, in which the cues of need for assistance from the adult were not nearly so apparent. For example, instead of scribbling with a marking pen and it accidentally falling off onto the floor, in those conditions, the adult would scribble with a marking pen and very deliberately throw it on the floor. Likewise, in those other conditions, instead of the adult putting some clothes on a clothesline and accidentally dropping a clothespin, in these circumstances, the adult was putting clothes on the clothesline and deliberately tossed the clothespin onto the floor. 18-month-olds did not help in those circumstances, revealing that, to a surprising extent, these toddlers were already sensitive to the cues of the need for assistance in the adults in the room. And where it was clear that the adult needed help, they moved in to provide assistance. When it was clear the adult did not need help, they didn't move in to provide assistance at all. In our lab, we have also replicated that, but we have added one more dimension to these procedures because we recognize that emotion can be a very important cue to how much an adult needs assistance. So in some of our procedures, we had our experimenters put on a sad face whenever they needed assistance or sometimes when they didn't need assistance to see how children would respond to the adult's emotional expression. We're in the process of analyzing those data right now, so I can't tell you the complete story about what we're finding. But what we have observed is that whether or not they are providing assistance, the toddlers are also responding in ways that reflect their sensitivity to the adult's sadness. We had one child, for example, who looked at the adult, stared at her, and then her whole face began to be sad and sober. We saw another child who, as she was moving to help the adult, she also patted the adult on her shoulder as if to offer comfort at 18 months. So we are discovering that in a way that I think we would not have expected 10 years ago at a time that we thought that children of this age were egocentric. Their sensitivity to others' feelings, their sensitivity to cues indicating a need for assistance, are causing them to respond in some surprisingly non-egocentric ways, and in ways we find very impressive. I should tell you that in the most recent research that's come out of these programs, it's become apparent that not only does this helping occur in the absence of any kind of external reward, indeed the adult in these studies is not even thanking the child, but indeed if you deliberately reward these toddlers for the helping they're doing, it does not increase their helping assistance. They're obviously internally motivated to do this. And that's a remarkable story. It tells us that the roots of cooperation and responsibility are far more complex and sophisticated than we'd ever believed. So it's time for us now to turn to consider what are some of the practical implications of this new knowledge. And in particular, what does this mean for how we might help young children develop skills in cooperation and responsibility? So let me offer some suggestions as food for your own thinking in this area. You've probably got lots of other good ideas of your own. Well, one thing that's important is really the same idea that we had talked about earlier with respect to the development of self-regulation. And this means that with respect to the development of cooperation and responsibility, we need to be sure that our expectations for children's behavior are developmentally appropriate. We need to make sure that children are capable of the kind of cooperative conduct we expect of them. I've talked several times about the ways in which, owing to their lack of cognitive flexibility, as well as because they simply want to do things that they want to do, we're often finding young children not sharing tricycles, not giving other people the blocks to play with when they're building a structure. And those are skills, those are capabilities for sharing that we can expect young children to show. But we have to be aware of the fact that the abilities to understand and respond to others, especially if it means giving up something you want to do, are still a work in progress at this age. And sometimes the kind of cooperation, the kind of sharing, the kind of willingness to participate in cleanup when children are in the midst of a favorite activity may be very limited at this age, and we need to act accordingly. A second thing that can help us help children develop these skills is to really be able to move beyond simply telling children about the rules to a description of the broader principles behind the rules. In other words, helping children understand the broader reason that we have the expectations and the rules that we do in the classroom. One example that my wife has suggested is when a child wants to be part of the group, not only encouraging children to share and to let the other person join the group, but to articulate the broader principle that let's make room for Jody because in our classroom we like everybody to be included. And doing so helps children understand the broader idea behind the rules and helps that become part of their thinking about the reasons why we cooperate as we do. As part of this, one good thing that early childhood teachers can do is to help build a classroom community where children feel a responsibility for our room and for taking care of our toys and for making sure that things are in their proper place in our room, so that everybody feels a sense of cooperation and contributing to a shared environment that all feel a part of. That classroom community can help to really move things along and children getting along with each other as well. As I mentioned earlier, warm, secure relationships between teachers and children can be a powerful incentive for cooperation. These warm relationships should never be something that we deliberately threaten as a way of extorting children's compliance. That kind of withdrawal of warmth and support should never be a threat that we use to force children to comply. But when we draw our attention to their positive conduct, when we make sure that children know that we've noticed, when they've gone out of their way to help another child or to participate in cleanup in a special way, that can feed their self-esteem and also feed their sense of being, a good child, which then provides further motivation for them to want to cooperate in the future. Of course, as teachers, we model with words the kind of cooperative, responsible conduct we expect children to show to others. We try to act toward children as we hope they will imitate us in their actions toward other children. In doing so, we can also encourage children to work out their own problems together, to entice children to refer to each other for assistance, so that rather than the teacher always becoming the first avenue to which children turn when they're faced with what may seem to be an insurmountable conflict with another child, to encourage children to communicate with each other and see if they can work out a better cooperative solution that will make every child satisfied. Children will be surprised, I think, at how readily they can do so when encouraged to do so by a teacher. And finally, as I've suggested several times, using children's positive behavior as a model for others, to use their own example as a way of highlighting the kind of behavior that we're looking for from everybody. Well, those are just some ideas for how we can take what we know about the development of cooperation and responsibility and make it into classroom practice. Now, if you're in a situation where you can do so, I encourage you to do the same thing yourself, to turn to the people you're with now and consider what are the implications of what we have learned for teachers, for children, and for parents. And in doing so, to make some of what we've learned even more real for our practical experience with young children.